There is a version of you that you have been carrying for a very long time. Not the version your family raised, not the one your job requires, not the one that shows up to social events and says the right things and smiles at the right moments. A different one, quieter, older somehow. One that occasionally surfaces in the middle of the night or in the silence after a conversation that left you feeling hollow. You have probably learned to move past it quickly, to get back to the day, back to your responsibilities, back to the reasonable and manageable version of yourself that other people recognize. But the feeling returns. It always returns. Not as a crisis, not as a breakdown, just a low, persistent signal. A sense that the life you are living, however functional it may appear, was built around something slightly beside the point. This episode is about that signal, about what it might mean, and about why some people eventually stop ignoring it. He had built a good life. That was not something he took lightly. By 43, he had a stable position at a firm he had been with for over a decade. He had a home he owned, a relationship that had lasted through difficult years, friends who knew his name and would show up if he called. He was not unhappy. He was careful to remind himself of that. But sometime around his 42nd year, something began to shift. Not visibly, nothing collapsed. Nothing dramatic announced itself at the door. It started with small moments of disconnection. He would be in the middle of a meeting, fully present in body, and realize that some interior part of him had simply wandered off. He would catch himself staring at his hands during dinner with his partner, thinking about nothing specific, and yet unable to return fully to the room. He began to notice how often he was performing, not lying exactly, but presenting, assembling, putting together the version of himself that a given situation seemed to require. At work, a version; at home, another. With old friends from college, a third version, younger, looser, less weighted by the years. He was good at all of them. That was the strange part. He was skilled at being the person each context needed, and yet somewhere underneath all of that fluency, there was an unease he could not name. A sense that he had become very capable of moving through his life without ever actually being in it. He did not tell anyone this. There was no clean way to explain it. He was fine. Things were good. Saying otherwise felt ungrateful, or worse, melodramatic. So he kept moving, kept assembling, kept performing. And the signal kept returning. One voice said, "This is just what adulthood is." You grow into roles, you adapt. The self is not some fixed, waiting thing. It is what you make in response to the world. Stability is built through consistency, through showing up, through being the person others can rely on. People who spend too much time asking who they really are tend to make a mess of everything around them. The exam in life can become an excuse, a way of staying in your own head while the actual world waits outside. That voice was steady and practiced. It had been refined over years. It sounded like every reasonable thing he had ever been told. The other voice was quieter, less articulate. It did not argue so much as press. It asked whether the consistency he had built was actually his, or whether it had been accumulated from the outside, from what was expected, from what seemed safe, from what had worked in the past and been repeated until it became automatic. It asked whether the self he had been maintaining was a true self or an efficient one. There is a difference between a life that fits you and a life you have become skilled at fitting into. He had never quite separated the two. He had assumed that fluency was the same as alignment. He did not like this second voice, not because it was wrong, but because it did not offer anything in return for the questions it raised. It was not trying to fix anything. It was just standing there in the dark, pointing at something he could not yet see. The rational voice found this useless. The other voice did not seem to care. And in the space between them, something remained unresolved, not loudly, but with the quiet persistence of a thing that has decided to wait as long as it needs to. He was not someone who avoided self-reflection. He believed that about himself. He read, he considered things. He had, at various points in his life, done the work of understanding why he was the way he was. He knew the outlines of his own history, the family patterns, the early decisions, the places where fear had quietly shaped his choices without announcing itself as fear. He thought he had accounted for most of it. What he had not accounted for was this, that knowing the pattern is not the same as being free of it, that you can understand the architecture of a cage and still be inside it. Insight, he was learning, does not automatically become change. You can name the thing clearly and still carry it, still repeat it, still organize your life around it without quite realizing you are doing so. When the discomfort surfaced, he managed it. He exercised more, he made plans. He reorganized things at home, at work, in his schedule. He found small improvements to focus on incremental progress that gave the restlessness somewhere to go. He was good at this. He could take an unpleasant feeling and redirect it into action, and the action would produce results, and the results would temporarily quiet whatever had been pressing. He was skilled at forward motion. But forward motion, he was beginning to notice, was also a way of never being still enough to ask a harder question. Every project completed, every goal reached, created a brief window of satisfaction, and then the window closed and the feeling returned, slightly repositioned but essentially unchanged. He had been treating the restlessness as a logistical problem, as something that could be solved by the right arrangement of circumstances. If he could just get certain things in order, the career at the right level, the relationship in a better rhythm, the finances stable, then whatever was pressing would ease. He was always nearly there. The threshold kept moving. He told himself he was growing, and in practical terms he was. His career was advancing. His relationships were deepening in the ways they were supposed to. His life, measured by most recognizable metrics, was working. What he could not yet say, what he was not quite ready to say, was that somewhere inside all of that growth, the actual center of him had remained strangely untouched. Like a room in the house that had been cleaned and organized and never truly entered. The furniture was arranged. The windows were clear. No one had sat in it for years. He had been developing. He was not sure he had been becoming. There is a difference, he could feel it. He just did not yet have words for it. Carl Jung spent much of his life trying to understand what it means for a person to become themselves. Not to improve themselves, not to optimize or discipline or refine, to actually become, to move toward the full shape of who they already at their core are. He called this process individuation, and he was careful about how he framed it. It is not a goal you arrive at. It is a direction you move in, slowly, with interruptions, over the course of an entire life. Most people, Jung believed, do not begin this journey in earnest until something in their outer life stops working well enough to distract them from the inner one. Jung observed that most people spend the first half of life constructing a persona, a functional, socially acceptable face that allows them to operate in the world. This is not dishonest. It is necessary. The persona is how we learn to belong somewhere, to be useful, to survive the requirements of being a person among other people. Every child discovers early which parts of themselves are welcomed and which are not. They learn gradually to lead with what is approved and manage what is not. This is not failure, it is adaptation. But the persona is not the self. It is a negotiation between who you are and what the world seems to require of you. And over time, if you are not careful, the negotiation begins to feel like the truth. You forget that the face you present was ever constructed. It becomes the only face you know how to wear. And if a person reaches midlife having mistaken one for the other, having poured all of their energy into maintaining the performance, they will often encounter a particular kind of restlessness, a hollow feeling, a sense that something at the center has been left unattended for a very long time. Jung also understood something about the parts of ourselves we push aside. He called this the shadow, not a sinister concept, but a simple one. The shadow is everything that does not fit the persona. The impulses, desires, fears, and capacities that were inconvenient, unapproved, or simply too complicated to carry forward into the life we were building. We do not destroy these parts. We set them down somewhere interior. We step over them on the way to the next obligation. They do not disappear, they accumulate. Jung would have recognized what this man was experiencing not as a malfunction, but as an invitation. The psyche, he believed, has its own intelligence. When the outer life becomes too far removed from the inner one, something inside begins to press back. Not violently, quietly, through disconnection, through an unease that cannot be resolved by productivity, through moments where the performed self briefly drops and something older surfaces in its place, in a conversation that went unexpectedly honest, in a dream that lingered past morning, in the silence after a long week when there was nothing left to do and no role left to inhabit. The signal is not a problem to be managed. It is the deeper self making itself known. He sat with that for a while. Not the idea exactly, but the feeling beneath it. Because when he let himself stop moving long enough, he could feel it clearly. There was a part of himself he had been keeping at a careful distance. Not hidden exactly, more like held in reserve, set aside for a future moment that never quite arrived. The way you save certain things for a special occasion and then, years later, find them still in the drawer, unused. It was the part that had its own sense of what mattered, its own quiet preferences and resistances, its own understanding of what felt true versus what felt merely expected. It had opinions about how he was spending his time that he had learned not to voice, even internally. It had a different quality of attention than the performance required, slower, less strategic, more interested in what was actually present than in what was supposed to happen next. He had been listening to it less and less over the years, not deliberately. The noise of building a life had simply grown louder than its voice. The meetings, the responsibilities, the ongoing management of a world that kept producing new requirements. There was always something more immediately demanding than the quiet thing at the center. He thought about the versions of himself he maintained, the work self, composed, reliable, measured, the partner self, attentive in the ways that were needed, present in the patterns they had developed together, the social self, resurrected with old friends, performing an ease that felt increasingly borrowed from a younger version of himself, each one competent, each one, he now admitted, slightly beside the point. He realized, sitting with this, that none of them felt fully inhabited. None of them felt like they had been chosen from the inside. They had been shaped largely by what each situation required, what was useful, what was approved, what would produce the least friction. He had mistaken this responsiveness for authenticity. Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we cannot accept do not disappear. They go underground, they collect in the interior, waiting, and eventually they return not as the emotions we want to feel, but as the ones we cannot explain. Anxiety that seems disproportionate, numbness where there used to be feeling, a flatness that no accomplishment seems able to lift. He had been calling this adulthood. He wondered now if it had another name. Not failure, not crisis, not even unhappiness exactly. Just the accumulated weight of a self that had been divided too long from the deeper thing it was actually trying to become. A person who had spent so long being what situations required that he had grown genuinely uncertain what he would be if no situation were requiring anything of him at all. There is a version of growing up that is really just becoming smaller. More careful, more edited, more fluent in the language of what other people need, more efficient at producing a self that functions well in context, that moves through rooms without disruption, that can be counted on to show up as expected. It does not feel like shrinking while it is happening. It feels like maturity, like responsibility, like the reasonable and necessary work of a person who understands that the world does not exist to accommodate every interior complexity they carry. You learn to carry things quietly. You learn which parts of yourself are appropriate for which rooms. You become organized in a way that looks from the outside like composure. And some of it is all of those things. Growing up does require something. It requires you to extend yourself beyond your own needs, to show up for people even when it is inconvenient, to absorb difficulty without dissolving. These are real things and they are not small. But some of what gets called maturity is something else. It is the slow disappearance of the parts of yourself that were never quite convenient, the parts that did not fit the role. That could not be explained in terms the situation recognized. That wanted things you were not sure you were allowed to want, not forbidden things, just particular ones. Things that would have required you to know yourself well enough to ask for them and to hold steady when the asking made you visible. Those parts do not get destroyed, they recede. They become quieter with each year that passes without being acknowledged. They learn not to surface at inconvenient moments. They learn to wait. And at a certain point in a life, usually when the outer structure has become very solid and the inner life very quiet, they begin to surface again. Not loudly, not urgently, just persistently. The way a draft comes under a door, you do not know exactly where it is coming from, but you can feel it. They are not trying to undo anything. They are not demanding that you abandon what you have built. They are only trying to say you have not finished. The work you thought was the work was only the first layer. There is something beneath it that has been waiting a long time for your attention, not because it is more important than what you have built, but because without it, what you have built rests on a foundation that was never entirely yours. This is not a catastrophe. It is an orientation, a realization that the journey you have been on had a different destination than the one you were aiming for. That the life being asked of you is not the one you have been performing, but the one that has been quietly forming underneath it. It is the longest conversation a person ever has, the one with themselves, the one that does not resolve in a weekend or a year or even a decade. The one that requires you to keep returning to a room you have been avoiding and to stay there a little longer each time, not until you find the answer, but until you become someone who can hold the question without needing to escape it. You have not been failing to arrive. You have been becoming, slowly, in ways that do not always announce themselves. The self is not something you find. It is something you gradually stop hiding from. Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. He did not say it was comfortable. He did not say it happened on a schedule or that it arrived with any particular clarity. He said it was a privilege, meaning it was not guaranteed. It was something that required a certain willingness. A willingness to stop performing long enough to hear what was actually there. Because not everyone gets there. Many people live out their lives inside the persona, polished, functional, and quietly distant from the thing that was always, underneath everything, trying to form. They build good lives. They fulfill real obligations. They are, in every measurable way, responsible and present, and still something remains untouched. Some interior country they never quite traveled into. Because the route was unmarked and the terrain felt uncertain, and there was always something more pressing waiting at the door. The journey toward the self does not look like anything in particular from the outside. It does not announce itself as a spiritual quest or a dramatic turning point. It looks mostly like an ordinary life, a person going to work, coming home, sitting with a feeling a little longer than they used to, asking a question they would previously have answered too quickly, noticing what they reach for when they want to disappear and choosing sometimes not to reach. It looks like a conversation that keeps returning, like the same room visited again and again. A little more light each time, not because the room has changed, but because you have learned to let your eyes adjust. There is no final version. No arrived-at self that signals the work is complete. Individuation, as Jung understood it, is not a destination. It is an orientation, a continued turning toward what is most true in you, even when that turning is slow, even when it costs something, even when the most convenient thing would be to look away. What changes over time is not that you find the answer. It is that you become less afraid of the question. And gradually, in the space that creates, something begins to breathe that has not had room to breathe in a long time. Not louder than everything else, but more distinctly yours. The life worth building is not the one that impresses anyone, not the one that performs well in every room or satisfies every expectation that has ever been placed on you. It is the one that, in its accumulation of honest moments, slowly begins to resemble who you actually are. That is the journey. It has been happening all along.